Does only
It gives
one
you a
person do it
countdown.
or all of us? Oh,
I did it.
it's going.
Too late now.
Dang, Leonard. It
Very
says
cool.
it started.
Yep, you should be live and ready to go.
All right.
Okay.
Well, we'll give it a couple minutes and let folks come in. I know they have that 10-minute break from the last session, so snacks. I'm sure folks are making popcorn. Very important part of this process.
It says, Leonard, that we don't officially start for like a minute and a half anyway.
Yeah.
And you guys can test my screen resolution. Can you see the dust and the cobwebs?
No, but you're really small because he's sharing his slides.
You're so tiny.
Good. Good.
I am still going to be the oddball out and not share my camera.
Sounds good. Oh, yeah.
I'm gonna share mine for a while and then take it off. Ooh, that scared me. I thought that was my document that flashed up.
What scared you?
Leonard drug a document across the screen, I think.
Oh.
I feel like I'm watching New Year's Eve and I need to blow a whistle or something in about 9 seconds.
You didn't bring any fireworks, Tim? That was your one job. I brought the cone. You're supposed to bring the fireworks.
Okay.
Awesome. So we'll go ahead and get started. I think we've given some times for folks to come in. So yeah, welcome everyone to this session. My name's Leonard Bruce, and welcome to this conference session, the GAP Work Plan Writing Tips. Like I said, my name's Leonard. I'm from Gila River Indian Community in Arizona, and I have run our GAP program for about 2 years now, and I'm being joined today by two folks out of the EPA, both Destinee and Tim, and I am going to let them introduce themselves in just a minute. See, I'm glad that Rob brought some fireworks. Thank you, Rob. But yeah, I just wanted to thank you all for being here. So in this session, we're going to be looking at some of the best practices for creating your GAP work plan and for your commitments. And also in this session, we're planning to have a little bit of dialogue around some of the items that the project officers see in your work plans and our work plan as well. What they've seen that works well, some items that they see that cause issues, and then also just provide you all with some practices for drafting your next GAP work plan. So a lot of the information today is not going to be like particularly complex. It's not going to be really very new, but when we're brainstorming this session, we realized that a lot of the issues that the EPA folks came across are related to the 5 Ws. So the who, what, when, where, and why. And specifically, some of the work plans tended to be either too light on the details or they were excessively specific, so way too specific. So we wanted to focus on showing how we can transform some of this work plan language to fit into the Goldilocks zone of being descriptive without having to write a 200-page novel, right? So as we hop into this, we're going to have each project officer highlight an example of a commitment that they have seen in a work plan, and we're just going to workshop those changes with you and showcase you some examples of how those can be changed from kind of wonky to just right. And then also, we want to kind of show from Gila River's perspective how we've integrated some of the advice that we've gotten from our GAP officer into our own process and our own work plans, as well as show you one of the tools that we at Gila River use to create and plan for our GAP activities as well. So one of the things I do want to caution before we get started, as I feel like is the norm whenever I'm in kind of GAP workshops, is caution that a lot of this stuff is kind of subjective. The ideas are a little bit subjective, and we're giving you some general best practices, but definitely always work with your assigned project officer on the language of your work plan, on your deliverables, etc. I've heard this a couple of times in different items where it's like, hey, can I do this thing? And it's like, well, it really depends, because it depends on what the language is. It depends on what the deliverable is going to be, etc. So again, general ideas, but a lot of times work with your project officer directly to make sure that the stuff actually works. And also, okay, so some really quick general housekeeping. Highly encouraging participation in the chat. We're going to be monitoring it up and bringing any immediate questions or responses you have to the presentation. We'll also try to work in some time at the end for further questions and conversation. I know that y'all can't unmute yourselves and talk, which is unfortunate, but definitely be active in that chat. And yeah, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I do want to say thanks again for coming. And Destinee, do you want to get started on the EPA side of introductions? And we'll move on to our first slide.
Of course. I'm Destinee Cooper. I'm not showing my camera specifically because I'm trying to save bandwidth over here. I don't want any internet issues. I work with tribes in the Chico area and then out in the Arizona area. Tim?
And I'm Tim Wilhite, and I work with tribes in far Northern California, and I'll turn my camera off after saying hi so that I can also preserve this rural bandwidth, this huge in Hornbrook, California. So hello, everybody. Can't see you. Wish I could. Can't wait till we get back together, but let's have some fun.
Cool. So we'll go ahead and get started. Destinee, do you want to get us started off?
Yes. These three bullets are specific highlights to what this overall presentation is going to be about. When we're talking about commitment descriptions related to GAP, we want specific actions that are necessary to achieve work plan outputs, deliverables, and outcomes. So one of the things that I remember hearing before is that somebody asked in a different session about using the word ongoing, and we're going to cover that in a little bit, but we'll explain why that doesn't help us in terms of conveying specific actions that are necessary. And in the second bullet, and this is what we're really going to be emphasizing, is we want the commitments to help convey who will do what, where, by when, why, and how often.
And then the last bullet, we threw besides the 5 W's in there, we threw that H in there, that how often, because how often is what gives a project officer or anybody else the information to justify the amount of funding being requested for a commitment or a component. And so quantifying effort is very important.
So as we go around this, and we were talking about when we were brainstorming this session, a couple of the things that came up about the attributes of a good commitment of writing these is making sure that when you're going through it, your match is you're matching those identified deliverables to the commitment, and so that they actually make sense with the commitment you're putting out. Making sure that you're justifying and supporting any requested costs that you're asking for. Also, a big one came up, and again, this is when we talk about this Goldilocks zone of it being just right, is making sure that the commitment is not way too short, but not way too long. And we're going to show some examples of that. But also, and a very important part is to not under-promise or over-promise those commitments that you're making. And we'll kind of get into this, but specifically this is related to, say that you're creating a new policy for the department. If this is something that you can create on your own, that's great. But if you put into your work plan that it's going to be something that you're going to have a final version, if it has to go through tribal council to get approval, you might want to just put that, hey, we're going to get a draft completed, because you can't guarantee that it's going to get through that whole process. So just things like that. And then finally, not being too specific, but not being too generic. Again, there has to be enough detail to be able to figure out what the costs are going to be and what you're doing. But if you're overly specific, it might get a little bit difficult to actually complete those things. And so we're going to be going into Tim, and he's going to show you some examples of how all this plays out. Again, please interact with the chat and keep going. Tim, go ahead.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to flash up 3 versions of the same simple work plan commitment. When we were all practicing this, Leonard suggested that we keep it something simple, because what we're trying to convey are sort of best management practices as opposed to anything really complex. And so almost every tribe I work with, you know, they have a commitment to attend staff meetings. So we picked that one. And so we're going to show you 3 versions of the same thing. And the way we want you to interact is I want you to look at the commitment that's up there now. That's the full commitment. And I want you to drop into the comments what you think is right or what you think is wrong about the commitment. Keeping in mind, maybe you want to steer your comments toward, does it tell us who will do what, where, when, and what, how often? So just the 5 W's and the H. And so you guys go ahead and start dropping those comments on this one, because and Leonard's going to monitor those, the chat box. And after we give you a few minutes to drop them in there, he's going to let me know what you say, and I'm going to comment on what you said. And then as you're doing that, I just want to emphasize that as a project officer, I just want you to know, I think most of you know, but we have to sign these internal documents when we're making grant awards that say that we reviewed the budget, we reviewed the work plan, and everything that was requested in the budget and shown in the work plan is actually reasonable. And we're going to focus on that term reasonable a lot.
So Tim, the first comment we have is from Christian talking about more details regarding outputs and deliverables. You want to talk about that?
You betcha. Yeah, reports. How many reports? You know, how long does it take you to do those reports? So somebody's really paying attention there. The outputs, different outputs take a different amount of time to complete. So just putting reports, that doesn't do the quantification for the project officer. So you're right.
Yeah, and there's a couple of comments about personnel too. Which employees, how many employees, et cetera, especially as related to the costs. There's a couple of comments about that.
Okay. And I suspected there would be some really seasoned tribal employees out there commenting, and you guys picked right up on it. Project officers compare budgets and work plans, and they have to be perfect matches. And so if you've got 3 people in your budget, we're going to look for descriptions of what 3 people are doing in that work plan. And so just saying personnel doesn't quite cut it. You might want to describe what the role, each employee that has a role in the work plan is actually.
Yeah, we've gotten a couple of answers about the personnel. Is there anything else on here that you'd want to point out, Tim?
Okay, the cost to us when we were doing this looks a little bit high. 624 hours for staff meetings would equate to about 4 hours for a 2-person shop, or 4 to 6 hours, depending on if you had a 2 or 3-person shop. And so the number of hours you're devoting in this example to staff meetings is something that is beyond the norm. Most people, EPA included, would just go crazy if you spent more than an hour or an hour and a half on staff meetings each week. So we would do the math. We're required to do the math, and you would probably get a comment saying, are you really going to spend 4 to 6 hours on a weekly staff meeting? And if you were, and you told us why, and it made sense, we would go ahead and accept it. But most of the time you might say, oh my gosh, no, I didn't even think of it that way. So, so that's mostly it. I think people picked up on almost everything, and then I covered the fact that the hours looked a little bit too much.
I'm glad that somebody did the calculation to that, because I had not done that before. That's a lot of hours a week, Melissa. Good call on that. She pointed out that's about 12 hours a week if you were a single person shop. So
yeah.
Okay, cool. So we'll go on to the next example, Tim.
Okay. And then, of course, I'm catching up to my notes in the last commitment. It didn't really say what you were going to cover in the meeting, so I'm going to throw you a thing right now and ask you a question. Can you fund with GAP and put in a GAP commitment? Can you cover things in staff meetings that are non-GAP related, like most programs? You got BI funding, you got NRCS funding, you got EQIP funding. You've got multiple funding sources, and can you in your staff meetings cover all of the work you need to do in your staff meetings with GAP? And the answer would be no. Each of the programs that you cover in a natural resource program or environmental protection program are kind of covered by those individual grant sources. So when you're thinking about a GAP work plan, scale the time and the cost to your GAP related work only. Okay. Now we're into the second one. We tried to improve this one, but you guys be the judge. look at this one, tell us what this one does that the last one didn't. Tell us if it says, you know, who will do what, where, when, why, and how often. And there might be a few problems with this one. So let's see if you guys pick up on
them. Dallas puts in work overload.
Work overload. Can you explain work overload a little bit more? Do you mean too much detail, or you just mean too many staff meetings? What do you mean by work overload?
We'll see if they put anything else additional. But Christian also writes, I like how it explains the meetings will review. However, I'd leave out days and times to allow a more flexible schedule. And Dallas also follows up with too much detailing. I think it's related to that.
Okay.
TMI.
There you go. And this is, we're getting in that zone Leonard talked about, which is there's a lot of subjectivity to this. So there's definitely more detail when you start hardwiring it like that. 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. on Tuesday mornings, POs won't require that. But some directors, in order to communicate both with their staff and with their council, they want this kind of detail. If you want that kind of detail, no skin off a project officer's nose, keep it in there. If you don't want this amount of detail, just tell us that you're going to do weekly staff meetings about how many hours a week you're going to do them and what you're going to cover, and that'll be fine. We don't need that much detail.
So Melissa also brought up, Tim, really quick, is that the outputs maybe should have some wiggle room in case any meetings are missed with that 52.
All right. You guys are really, really pumping this one. Several things. One is that 52 sets of meeting notes when you might be off during Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever. There's no wiggle room in that. The second thing is a project officer doesn't really want to see 52 sets of meeting notes. There's such thing as output or deliverables overload, and this is definitely it. And so 2 or 3 sample copies of your weekly meeting minutes would suffice. We don't need to see 52 sets.
Yeah, so another question that came up was Christian put in is commitment end dates. Is that something that you would expect to see in here, Tim?
Yeah, that's a good question. Commitment end dates kind of tie back to the old gap on line stuff where you had a specific column for end dates. And what the regs actually call for are timelines and milestones. And so if you say something like weekly staff meetings, you've kind of met the timeline milestone requirement for the regs. And so if you want to keep an old column called end dates like Gap Online had, you're welcome to, but sometimes embedding those milestones and stuff like that, the dates that you're going to complete portion A, portion B, and portion C of your work plan or your commitment is also fine. You don't need a special column for an end date if you don't want to have one.
There's been a couple of comments about sign-in sheets as well. Is there something you want to talk about with that, Tim?
Yep.
Do you love sign-in sheets?
Yeah, there you go. Like if you're a one-person shop, somebody mentioned that. Wow, we're going to get a lot of benefit from seeing your sign-in sheet, aren't we? We probably don't need to see the sign-in sheets. Rather than stressing lots and lots of outputs and deliverables like this one does, and we baited you and you guys are passing with flying colors. We don't need to see a lot of sign-in sheets, just maybe 1 or 2 when you submit those other things. We don't want to have to track all that down at the end of the year when we're doing joint evaluation. So don't overpromise that kind of stuff.
I think that's about it. Is there anything else you want to point out with this one, Tim?
I'll review a few things. Nice commitment detail in this one, but perhaps more than needed. You guys picked up on that. The hours look to be pretty reasonable now and customary. It equates to 1 hour staff meetings for a 3-person shop or 1.5 for a 2-person shop. So that one, a project officer would say, hey, that's in the ballpark. That's pretty close. One of the little things is I would ask why the cost is a nice even number. How often when you're calculating a component or commitment cost, would you come up with a nice even number? If you're got the pen to the paper and you're doing some math. And so I would probably ask somebody, really, did it come out to 4,000? And if it came out to something like 4,999 and you wanted 5,000, I'd say, okay, super. I was just checking. And so that's something to think about, is that most of them don't come out to nice even numbers. You guys picked up on the fact that we don't need or want 52 sets of meeting notes. Focus reporting to us and stuff like that in the body of your report and cutting down on the deliverables. That's the trend that we're trying to promote in the tribal section. And that's about it.
Yeah. So the other thing, Tim, and you brought this up, is basically for the cost, having that round number. If you can show the calculations of how you got to that round number, it's a little bit more easy to stomach. But
yeah, absolutely. If you had a cost estimator, it's a tool that a lot of tribes are using now, and it came out to something like $4,999. That $5,000 would be fine. But if it was just you're maybe an inexperienced director or something and you're taking guesses, we can hook you up with people like Leonard and lots of other experienced directors that don't guess. They actually try to conceptualize what they're doing and take notes and make sure that all the costs are well documented. And so there's nothing wrong with that 5,000 if it's backed up by math, but if it's not, we can hook you up with people that really do know how to do the math.
Well, cool. So let's move on to this last one then, Tim.
Okay. And we don't need to belabor this one. You guys are getting the hang of it, but go ahead and throw your stuff in there. If you're having fun, throw it into the chat and stuff like this. But this is our last example, and we baited you here a little bit on something else, so you guys get to guess where we baited you. There's some improvements over the last one that I'll just point out. We on the outputs and deliverables, we have 3 sample meeting notes. On the cost, it's $4,523. I picked a non-even number. And so that would kind of signal to me as a project officer that you're probably somewhere behind the scenes or even front and center are doing some really good math. I took out the personnel, attend 1 hour, instead of saying personnel or which positions will attend 1 hour staff meetings. I just took that out and said attend. I was trying to bait you there because this takes us away from you guys describing roles for each person in the work plan. And there are cases when that would be okay. And I think we're going to get to that in just a second, the next slide. But Leonard, did anybody have any beefs about this one?
Well, a question that I think is really good from Dallas asking about, you say sample meeting notes. What do you mean by that?
That means if, you're going to have roughly 48 to 52 sets of meeting notes, pick your 3 best and give them to us and say, hey, this is a representative sample of our meeting notes so that you can see what we covered during our staff meetings. So just pick the ones you want. We don't really care.
Cool. You mean to?
So
one question that came up from Ryan was 1 hour a week equals 156 hours. So how do you get to that?
How did I get to 156? I don't remember. It's 156 divided by 52. What's that come out to? Do you guys have your calculators with you? I turned my phone off.
3. But yeah, I do think that's a good point, is that it might need to be pointing out that there's multiple staff on there.
That's right. Okay, so you guys took the bait on that one, and so we're going to explain that with the next slide, I think.
Carrie also asked really quick though, is it acceptable to leave out the start and end dates for those?
Like I said, the regs call for milestone dates, schedules, and things like that. The end date is actually, that's the way they got at milestones and stuff with the end date in Gap Online. They had to have a column for it. But on the staff meetings, in this particular example, it's like weekly staff meetings. That's good enough. We know that it's each week. So there are milestones. The milestones are each week. And so that's good enough. On different types of activities, like outreach and education, sometimes you plan things around holidays. Sometimes you plan them around Earth Day. And when you have things like that, those are milestones. So tell us about when you think you're going to have each of those commitments coming off, when you're going to actually do them. Okay.
I think that relates to this next one. Move over to it, Tim.
Right. And so this is an example. This is why that last commitment could get away with not saying anything about the director doing this, the planner doing that, the technician doing that, is because this tribe, I pulled this from some real examples. This tribe actually used a cost estimator that looks like this, and each position they have in their budget is hardwired into this commitment cost estimator. And so they told us right here, front and center, how many hours the director was going to spend on the staff meetings and how many hours the manager was going to spend. So when you provide a tool like that along with a work plan, you can probably cut down on the who does what in the work plan and rely on this. So we baited you there, and this is why I wouldn't, as a project officer, wouldn't require the who in the previous commitment description, because you gave it to me right here. And it's very quantified. It covers every single line item for every single commitment. And it's almost like a dream. A tool like this is a dream. It's great. So that's about it, I think, right, Leonard?
So we'll go ahead and move into Destinee's piece of it then.
So for the rest of our slides, we're going to go ahead and ask you, the audience, to, by all means, put whatever comments you have into the chat as we go along, but we're going to save them now till the end of the session. The next piece that we're going to be going through is a couple of examples from me, and I'm specifically starting off with this slide about action words for eligible commitments. One of the things you'll notice that isn't on here is the word ongoing. And one of the reasons for that is that we really want to know what it is that you're doing. So if it's ongoing, it leaves the question of, well, what got done before versus what's happening next. And Tim was working with an example of something that we know is going to happen from year to year, which are the staff meetings. But maybe one year you're doing them every week. The next year it's that they're actually happening every other week because the department decided to change it. So you would still, instead of saying ongoing, you would leave that word out and otherwise use the description that he was giving us examples about. The words on this slide that are in bold for a reason. These are the ones that you're going to be seeing in the examples on the slides that are coming up. So let's go and go to the next slide. It's not important whether or not you can read the text, so I'm just going to start off with that. This is an emergency response example. And the thing that I want you to note on here is that I just got done talking about the action words, and pay attention to the fact that there are circled words in each of the individual commitments in here, except for number 3. So commitment 3 doesn't have one. And usually when we start to see that those words aren't showing up, we want to know why. So for number 3, is the question that I would ask as the PO is that commitment actually telling me what they're doing? Tribal lands and resources covered by an EPA compliant ERP. I'm not too sure what that is. I'm not too sure what they're going to be doing with it. I might read the deliverable because that might give me a little bit more information. So to make the EPA staff and tribal council has all of mountain tribes land is covered by the tribe's ERP. That's not too much more information, so I'm not really sure what they're going to do. So in this example, I would actually ask the tribe for more information because I need more details to answer those questions about the 5 W's and how. Next slide. We're going to start going through these questions. One of the things that we wanted to convey to the grantees is that the layout, not just of your individual commitments, but of your component is really up to you. So one of the things that get out of the different examples that we're showing you is that you can lay it out in different ways. And really what it's about is whether or not we're getting the information, not necessarily exactly how it's being conveyed. So for this component, I mean, it is just an example, but their why is up there at the component level within the environmental results and the indicators. They don't have it at the commitment level, and that's okay. Next slide. So the who on this particular example is only in that estimated component FTE. We probably want more information. We want more information about who's doing which of the commitments. The thing that you don't know that I know is that this is actually an example from a one-person department, so I know who's already doing it. I don't necessarily need to have that information. The other thing to note is that if it was more than one tribe or more than one staff person, they may have another column off on the right that actually conveys to me like who the staff are that are actually working on it. So that's another way to do it as well. Next slide. The what. So pay attention to the fact that for the individual commitments, only sub pieces of those commitment descriptions are actually highlighted in here. What are they doing is important because it's just sort of that general, like, what is it that they're trying to work on? You can get a little bit more specific, and let's go to the next slide, because it can get down into the how. Now, the how is what's missing in this component. So this is one of the questions that I would have gone back to the tribe and said, look, I have a general idea of what you're trying to do, but I need more. I need more to understand really how you got to this 0.5 FTE. I need more to help me understand sort of like what are the steps you're taking to doing this stuff. I need more. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So the buy-when, you were all really good at being able to point out about the milestone dates. I think you have been well trained on that. This particular tribe went ahead and used the milestone date column. So there's that. Next slide. And then the where. So where is really up to the tribe, and it's up to what work is being done. What I mean by that is that there are many tribes in our region that have discontinuous land. And it may be that something's happening in one part and not over in the other, or it might be happening across all the different, parts of the land base. It also could be that you're working on something where you're going to local meetings. Well, telling us that you're going to be attending, going to those local meetings conveys to us that you're going to probably need local travel money, and that's something that we would be expecting to see in your budget. So giving us a little bit of information about where helps us to know what we should be anticipating when we're going off to the budget piece. Next slide. So this is the question of what is it that EPA is going to get as a result of the work being done. We really do hone in on the deliverables piece. We hone in, and that's what we're looking for in that column. We're looking for what should I expect to see as the project officer for this work. And again, you don't see anything highlighted in that column because I'm not really sure exactly what it is I'm going to get. It doesn't mean that you don't have like outputs. It just means I'm not sure about the deliverables piece. So the next slide is going to go into a second example, specifically also for emergency response. And again, I went ahead and circled on here that there were active words within the individual commitments. So for this one, they have at least one of those words in each one of the commitment descriptions. And for this particular tribe, you can see down in commitment 3 that there's a specific piece in there that's highlighted. And the reason why that's highlighted is because GAP can't pay for an entire emergency response plan, but we can pay for the EPA compliant portion. So what this particular grantee was conveying is that GAP is only going to be paying for this specific slice of what we're trying to do. And they gave us that information in the commitment description itself. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So again, this goes to why. Unlike the last example, they not only give us information about why at the component level, they also give it in terms of the 2 of the individual commitments. So again, it has to do with how you choose to structure your overall component. Next slide. The who. We talked a little bit about who. You can actually include the who in your commitment description. This particular grantee chose to actually provide a list at the end of their commitment description. It's just another way to do it. When we are thinking about that component FTE, they also had they did have off on the right-hand side, like an estimator for how they got to that 0.18. So that's just a missing piece of information from this slide, but they did have that. Next slide. So here's the what. What are they doing? They didn't provide too much on that because it's the more general stuff. This tribe likes to hone in on the how, so go ahead and go to the next slide. The how is what they tried to convey the most, because I know there's not how in every single one of these commitments, but it is what they try to dig into, even when we're otherwise talking about the other pieces of their commitment descriptions. The how was necessary for number 3, for commitment 3, because like I said earlier and what I highlighted earlier, there is some information with commitment 3 that it wasn't clear about how to differentiate between the EPA compliant piece versus the overall emergency response plan and trying to differentiate those. So they did go into a lot of how, what I consider to be a lot of how for that particular commitment. Go ahead and go on to the next one. The by when, they also had the milestone dates, so check on that. Next slide. And then the where. This is another grantee that has only one plot of trust land. They don't have any discontinuous land. So the where wasn't hugely important on this one. They did have, in one of these commitments, they alluded to a little bit of local travel, but it actually ended up not being that way. Like they didn't need to have local travel. And I was able to understand that simply by looking at their budget and comparing it to what I otherwise thought I might see based off of these commitment descriptions. Go ahead and go on to the next slide. So what is EPA going to get for the work completed? Notice I highlighted all the information that's in that last column, specifically because that is what we're going to receive for that work being done. And that's what we're looking for. So you can go ahead and go on to the next one. I think this is actually your turn.
This is my turn. Excellent. Well, again, I'm going to continue with Destinee's style of doing some showing. Again, you don't have to read the details of it if you don't want to. Although if you're super excited about administrative and outreach examples, definitely take a look. But I'm just going to be going through and highlighting some of how we build our work plans and our commitments based on some of these things. And then I'm also going to be going, like I said, and showing a tool that I use when we're starting to draft our plans and think about what we're going to be doing each year. So this is an administrative example that we're using from this year's work plan, actually, where we're going to be building GIS capacity and support within our office. And we'll get to the questions towards the end because we're running a little bit short on time. I think we'll be okay with some time at the end, though. But okay, so this is an administrative example. I just really wanted to highlight the different aspects of this in terms of the who, what, when, where, why. The who. So you can see here, one of the things that we do within our commitments is these are the who's. We put it within the kind of paragraph, and then we also pull it out at the end to just showcase exactly which positions are going to be on there. The other part of this is the what or the how. So we answer both of those questions within this, saying what exactly we're going to be doing and how we are going to be doing that. The other part that we do is the when. So I appreciate Christian asking that question because I also, we put our end dates on here. We don't necessarily do milestone dates. So, hey, I learned something today. We're going to make some changes. But I do think it's super useful to, especially if you're going to be having events. So one of our other events that we have is an Earth Day event. I think it is useful to put in and showcase when you think that event is going to be happening, that milestone date. But that's the when. And then the EPA, again, we pull out what that output and deliverable is going to be and put it at the end just so we can showcase, hey, this is what we're going to be doing. This is the kind of narrative form of how we do this. We also have an Excel sheet, and I'll show you a little bit of that as I get to it. So, okay, the second one, and we wanted to kind of pick examples that folks probably had the most often. And this one is an outreach example. So this is specifically a one-day workshop that we put on for community stakeholders in our legislative and executive branch that we invite them to it. COVID's made it difficult, so that's been fun. But just kind of wanted to showcase what this is. So with the who, you'll notice that I highlight this a couple of times. We actually have two positions that are involved in this commitment. One of the positions, my position, the planner and policy analyst, I used to have a much more active role in this. We've since changed it to have our outreach specialist doing most of the work with it, but I still help out with the event, so I'm still under those positions. But when I was a part of this and the way that we crafted this commitment before was pulling out and showcasing each part of the different positions and what they were doing within that commitment. And so again, this is where I made that disclaimer at the beginning. Some of this stuff can be very dependent on what your project officer wants to see. The other thing is, again, this what and how gets broken up a couple times because we're kind of showing what each position is going to be doing, and then the how at the end of how are we going to show that this was actually useful is putting together that questionnaire to gain feedback from the attendees. Again, there's a big win. we end date, we anticipated this being before the end of the year. And then again, the EPA. So what are we providing to the EPA to showcase what we're doing with that? Which for us is kind of just a quick event agenda, and then we do a summary detailing the event as well as just some key indicators from it. So how many folks attended, what the questionnaire results were, and stuff like that in our quarterly reports. So one question that came up during our practice that I think is important, and I think Tim touched on this and Destinee has also touched on this, is why we don't have any wares in any of our stuff, which I think there's two big reasons for that. The first one is when we're creating our commitments, one of the things that we do is we outline our specific locations if it's needed. So we have a continuous reservation, we have a continuous community, so we don't have outskirts that we have to go to. But we do highlight when we have specific district meetings. So our legislative districts that we have within our community, we have 7 districts. And so if we are going to go to each of those districts for an outreach event, or if we're going to go and do some type of curriculum, usually related to outreach, we will highlight those within our commitment to show the where of where we're going. The other thing that we also do that I think is important, especially related to travel, either if you're going to be doing local travel outside of your regular zone, or if you're going to be going out of state, especially for some type of travel or training, is to specify those locations if you know them. Otherwise, just putting, hey, we're going to do an out-of-state travel. That way, especially when you're tying your costs to that, you can start tying airfare and lodgings and all that other stuff. It just helps with planning, especially if you know that it's going to be outside of the state. So that's kind of like where we think about with the where. And those are the 2 examples that I wanted to showcase, and hopefully the highlights help a little bit. I recommend doing that. For me, it helps a little bit when I'm going through with our commitments and with our overall components to go through and do those highlights and actually show like, okay, have I actually put down what the who is? Have I put down what the where is? If it's needed, and then it helps me just kind of think about stuff. Luckily, I do have a good project officer who will very frequently call me out and be like, this isn't very fleshed out. Can you provide more information? Which I think is super useful, especially when sometimes, when we're dealing with 100 different things and we're just like, look, I'm going to go to this training. Well, you need more information than that. So I appreciate being called out sometimes. So the other part, I wanted to showcase this. Again, don't pay attention to the numbers. I put those in there for effect so that you can see how it's kind of calculated. But this is one of the things that we use. This is a cost calculator. I know that I think looking at the chat, it does look like that cost estimator is put into the chat, and Tim or Destinee has kind of shown where you can find that. I don't use that one. It probably would be useful, but I created my own, and I'm happy to share that with anyone who wants it. But what I do is essentially the same thing as that cost estimator is. I put in our salaries, I put in what our estimated fringe percentages, as well as the percent that we're funded on the grant that we're doing. And we don't just do this with GAP. We do this with a lot of grants that we work with to make sure that we're planning properly. And I'll kind of go through really quickly of how we do that. So essentially, you just really have to look at these red boxes and put the information in that is needed. And from there, it calculates, what's the number of hours that we're supposed to have. And this is really important, especially during planning, because we have to use these hours to figure out, okay, but what are we going to use this hour on if we have to complete that? The other part that we look at is what's the total actually amount of match that we're getting from these grants that we need to make sure that we're putting that money into personnel. Again, when we're doing our costs, we have to make sure that that's going somewhere. And then I'm going to be showing you this, and I'm going to preface this right now. You don't have to look at the whole thing because there's a lot of text on there. I just wanted to put it in to kind of showcase an example. But don't be scared. It'll be fine. I'll walk us through this. So what we do is with our components and with our commitments, we list out all of them. And we start thinking about early on in the year, okay, what are the commitments that we want to do? We want to figure out how many hours of our time is going to be going on those, and then what is that going to cost roughly? And so you'll notice I messed up a little bit on here and on purpose to show you some little red buckets. I do a lot of conditional formatting when I make these because I am terrible with math. So That's one of the things I try to use Excel as much as possible to make sure I'm not messing up. I'm a social scientist at heart, not a math scientist. So one of the things that we do, though, is as we're planning this out, we make sure, for one thing, the number of hours that we're putting in are actually matching on these commitments. And it's really important for us to do this because when we're looking through this and I'm starting to put in like, okay, how many hours is somebody going to be working on a different task? I want to not just kind of guesstimate. I want to actually put in, all right, this is how many hours they're going to be working on this. I don't provide this to our project officer because this is kind of internal planning stuff. And sometimes, we're not going to do 100 hours on Earth Day, but we know that we're going to get pretty close, and it helps us plan out what is that cost going to be in personnel. But the other part too is making sure that when we're looking at the total costs, those match up with the total required. Again, it helps us as we're planning out our personnel. Operating is a whole different beast, which is also fun, but we also use different Excel calculators for that as well, so that we can combine all this stuff into the package that we send out. But I do want to encourage, I know I put it in the chat, and I think Tim was part of this, of doing the presentation on the tools for GAP work plan planning and showing how that cost estimator tool is used. But there's also some tribes that were on that presentation that also have just some really cool Excel tables and some different ways that they do it, that they've modified that cost estimator, which again is very useful, if nothing else, just to ask for it so that you can start cribbing some of the formulas they use or some of the conditional formatting they use. Because when you have like a really well-made to just plug in numbers, it makes life a lot easier. So highly recommend it. Especially in terms of planning. And I think that's all I have for now, but we have about 5 minutes left. I don't know if there's other comments in the chat that you've been seeing, Destinee, that we want to get to, but if anybody has any questions or has any comments or anything, put them out there and let's talk.
I don't see any questions. There was one thing in here about where's the workbook at, and JR went ahead and provided the link to that. I'm about to go ahead and put in here that there's the sessions that Leonard is referring to. We did a session at last year's conference, and I know that link is available. I'll have to do a little bit of digging to find it. Unfortunately, the session at this year's conference was yesterday, but that link will be available. So folks will be able to go back and reference that too.
And I just want to emphasize that we talk a lot about budget tools when we're talking about writing commitment descriptions. And why is that? And like we said at the very beginning of the presentation, it's because budgets and work plans are twins. They have to match perfectly. And so you're not going to want to put things in your budget that aren't needed in your work plan and vice versa. So they have to kind of match. And so, and Leonard's right. We developed a cost estimator tool because we noticed that a lot of tribes were just killing it with these tools. We're getting really good estimates and documenting their costs really well. And so we felt compelled to kind of create one just as a talking point and stuff. But there are a lot of directors out there that use these tools a lot more than we do. And so there is definitely no one way to calculate those costs or document them. There's a lot of ways to use Excel or anything else.
The other thing, I do want to pull up these questions because I think it might be useful to bring these out and discuss it a little bit, is Christian did ask, how do they answer the why again? I think related to tribes and the work plan. And kind of is the question why they want the work to be done. I think I'm getting to the heart of that question is like, so when you're saying why, what do you mean by why?
Yeah, and I think part of it could be, I'm going to guess why people are putting it in there, but sometimes we might want to know why somebody needs to do something or wants to do something. And so when they provide a little bit of background and just a little statement that says, man, we're just getting pummeled with dumping, illegal dumping, so we need to do this, and that. So the why can sometimes get you there, but sometimes the why is so obvious you don't have to spend 6 sentences explaining the why. But sometimes people, their natural writing style is to put the why in and then to go in and explain what they're going to do to address it. So let's see what else people put down there, but that's my thought about the why.
Pam did answer that question too. It connects back to the indicators. It also connects to like what is the capacity building thing that you're trying to do. So your commitments are literally the steps you're taking to try to get to someplace, and we want to know like where you're trying to get to. That's your why. One of the other questions that I just saw come up too was about where to find, I think it was Adam asked about where to find the templates. So JR in the chat, Adam went ahead and put in there a link to the notification, and you'll see in the notification not only a template to the workbook, but also templates to potential templates, options to what your work plan format can look like. And if you're a PPG, if you're a PPG, it can also be a little bit different than what you see in the GAP notification. But if you're in a PPG, go ahead and get a hold of your project officer, and we can send you examples specifically for those.
Pull out, I think James has an interesting question too, where it's how do you address opportunistic programs, either that pop up during the year? I think I'm getting to that question. Correct me if I'm wrong, James, but like, how do you address opportunistic programs that maybe pop up through the year, or that like you did not anticipate in your work plan, you know, a year and some change before you turned it in?
I can try to field that, and other POs can weigh in. But first of all, things like that are the norm, not the exception. And so, you know, you won't have it's rare that tribes have a wholesale change in their work plans, but it's very frequent when tribes have small changes in their work plans. And so if something crops up during a year that's more important than the stuff that you originally put in your work plan, you basically get on the phone and get with your project officer and explain what happened, and you can trade in a new task for a task that you haven't started working on. Those things are meant to be pretty flexible, and what you write at the beginning of the year is just an estimate of what you're going to do. And when those surprises come around, and they do very often, just change your work plan in concert with your project officer, and then keep on trucking.
That's part of the reason why we wanted to do this presentation, is specifically because we're looking for that Goldilocks. And I know we're about to end.
Yep. We're done.
We're done.
So I appreciate everyone being here. I know it's like the end of the day. So I appreciate y'all being here and not just taking naps and interacting with us. It was really great. Hopefully you got some good information. And, you know, if you want to email, definitely email us, or yeah, good stuff. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.